Thank you, madam. Thank you, sir. And good morning, everyone. Good morning, our distinguished guests, honorable faculties, and dear students. I'm Afsana Anjum, would like to welcome you all on behalf of Center for Advanced Theory and General Education Department and to the seminar on Intimation of Revolution, Global Sixties and Making of Bangladesh. To deliver this speech, I would like to introduce you with Subho Basu from the University of McGill, Canada. Before beginning the program, I would like to request you all to turn off your microphone. And secondly, I would also like to request you to follow the one thing, that is, if you have any question during the seminar or during the discussion, please ask in the chat box. Then definitely our guest and professors will get back to you after the program. Thank you, everyone. And to introduce our guest, honorable guest, I would like to invite our honorable Professor Salimullah Khan sir, the Director of Center of Advanced Theory. Thank you, everyone. That's all from me. And sir, please introduce our guest. Salimullah sir. Sir, achen probably, ma'am.
Salimullah sir. Salimullah sir, sir ke phone karo.
আপনার
Ma'am, sir is having some technical problems, so he's
start, and then when Professor Khan will be online, we shall go back to him.
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas with the members of faculty at University of Liberal Arts Bangladesh, and also with students and also with other distinguished guests. It's a great opportunity to speak about the birth of Bangladesh in Dhaka, and I really appreciate this opportunity. I am also quite inspired by the fact that Dr. Salimullah Khan is presiding this conference, or presiding this presentation. And I was familiar with him, not physically, but virtually through Dhaka Broadcasting Corporation's regular digital streaming of his talks. And so it's a pleasure to be with him. And I am obviously grateful to my friend and colleague, Dr. Professor Ajijul Russell. And Ajijul Russell is a close friend of mine and also a very promising historian. So without much ado, I shall start talking about my topic. Russell warned me that not to speak, not to read from a paper, but I think for brevity's sake, I should read so that I can finish my talk within 35 minutes. So my talk is entitled Intimation of Revolution, Global Sixties and the Making of Bangladesh. And I begin with the idea of Global Sixties and East Pakistan. The image of Sixties as a transformative radical era have proved to be enduring. As Tor Egil Portland points out, that it is only 60s among all the decades of the 20th century that has a journal devoted to its events. This journal, in its aim and scope, boldly announces that it is the only academic peer-reviewed journal to focus solely on this transformative decade of history. The key locution here is the word transformative. The era became associated with revolution and radical revolutions and radical confrontations between forces of establishment and insurgents globally, and experiments with alternative lifestyle in advanced capitalist world. Throughout the world, successive generations of politicians and social activists waged culture wars defending or assaulting the radical meaning of 60s and its historic legacy. The decade began with polarizing but successful national liberation struggle in Caribbean, in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 seems to announce the beginning of an era that would be volatile, unpredictable, and that did not follow any predetermined master narrative of revolutionary transformation. Intellectually, the global 60s began with the writings of Fanon, Che Guevara's Foco theory, and the work of Regis Debre's Revolution Within Revolution, alongside Mao's On Contradiction. These texts became central to the art of making revolution and were read in as disparate places as, to name a few, Palestine, Algeria, France, Congo, and East Pakistan. Even Sartre's exposition of existentialist notions of Marxism and Althusser's ruminations on Marx became a critical source of debate in dingy and overcrowded coffee house in Kolkata. The occurrence of cultural revolution in China, state offensive in Vietnam, a seeming revolutionary coup and reactionary counter-coup in Indonesia, student revolution in Pakistan, the victory of United Front in West Bengal, and the occurrence of Naxalite movement in India, the conclusion of Algerian and the beginning of Palestinian national liberation struggle, the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, the student uprisings in France, Mexico, United States, and West Germany, civil rights movements in the United States, global peace movement, and the rise of New Left transformed 60s into a decade of hope, protest, and rebellion. It was an era when new aesthetics in literature, theater, film, and musicals had created spaces for forging counter-hegemonic cultural domains among youth throughout the world. Many among youth, through such counter-hegemonic cultural discourse, raised questions about modes of governance and existing ways of doing politics. The idea of global 1968 came into existence by the end of the decade, and the study of 60s became a critical point of intervention in social science, particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It is now widely accepted that the global analysis of 1960s is untenable without an extended conversation on the Third World. Frederick Jameson, a literary scholar, rightly locates the beginning of what will come to be called the 60s in the Third World. This book looks at the 60s from a third world location. It examines a rather understudied revolution that began in the predominantly agrarian society of Lower Gangetic Delta of Pakistan. It seeks to provide a radical reading of 1960s Pakistan as an integral component of global 60s. The story of global 60s starts here with the intellectual quotation of Bengali student activists with the revolutionary text of 60s. In East Pakistan in 1969, socialist leaning but purely Bengali nationalist nucleus circle established by Sirajul Alam Khan and Qazi Arif. Texts of Che Guevara, Debre, General Giap, and Mao were described as essential readings. These nationalist revolutionaries believed in romantic understanding of a new dawn of exploitation-free society through the establishment of within Bengali nation state. No doubt, as Jameson maintains, supposedly non-class collective entities such as students played a role in the making of global 60s in Pakistan as in other locations. Yet Jenson's much quoted for observation that Marxist theory entered into a crisis in global 60s because I quote, active political categories no longer seem to be those of neutral class, is based upon a particular reading of events in Paris and other Western locations. Fact, in fact, throughout the history of this Pakistan, labor unrest seems to define the political contour of the country. Unfortunately, much of the historical literature on the subject in Bengali also views the working class unrest as a prefiguration of national awakening and thus classificates them into the role of appendage of nationalist movement. Yet in East Pakistan, working classes national constitutional autonomic body. They played a critical role as a collective that transformed the revolution to the ruling military junta. Alongside workers, peasants were mobilized along class lines based on the emerging contradictions between rich peasants and middle class. Many among rich peasants were also as power brokers by military bureaucratic and they were termed as basic democrats had gained access to developmental funds, while other segments of surplus farmers, namely middle peasants, did not have access to it. Though admittedly, the category of middle peasants is tenuous in East Pakistan, in East Pakistani context, but Eric Wolf was not far off when he argued that middle peasants constitute the pivotal group in peasant rebellion of Mexico, Russia, China, Vietnam, and Cuba. As Wolf maintains, within poor peasants and landless laborers, depending on landlords for their livelihood, have very little tactical power, no independent resources to launch and sustain a rebellion. These middle peasants alone had the necessary minimal tactical freedom to challenge the established order. It was also the children of these middle peasants who moved into schools, colleges, and universities and participated in radical movements in East Pakistan. Thus, class remained critical to the political rebellion in the 60s. Yet it would obviously be simplistic to assume that these antagonistic class contradictions automatically led towards a revolution. Hannah Arendt's observation that the revolution is what disintegration of society is possibly true in East Pakistan in 1960s. Moving a step further, De Nerdo, another scholar of revolution, had rightly argued that it was the strategists who had conceptualized the path of revolution, particularly in the case of China and Vietnam. In East Pakistan too, Jacobin-minded pro-Chinese radical Muslim theologian Maulana Bhashani played a critical role in this mobilization in 1960s. He used red flags and red hats as symbols of peasant mobilization. Thus, the very symbols around which peasants were mobilized were associated with communist movement. Class politics, even if the language was being crafted by radicals, remained inscribed on the 60s in East Pakistan. Revolutionaries like Maulana Bhashani, despite their own inchoate ideological formulations of Islamic socialism, remained committed towards a radical redistributive agenda. The term long 60s is conceptualized by Arthur Marwick in the context of what he calls cultural revolution in Germany, Italy, and France, as well as the United Kingdom and the United States. The significance of the term 60s lies in the acknowledgement that the 1960s cannot simply be studied as limited to a particular decade, that is 1960 through 1969. Rather, it has to be studied in terms of shared objectivity of a particular historical moment, stretching beyond, but incorporating events in that decade. The long 60s in East Pakistan began in 1954 with an election within the context of a spasmodic and rickety constitutional process. It was this constitutional process that provided access to power by politicians associated with Awami League. In 1956, This brief flirtation with power in Pakistani state led to the split in that pivotal local autonomous organization on the question of Cold War alignment. Pakistan joined United States-sponsored military bloc Baghdad Pact and SEATO in 1954. Though the decision to join such military pacts was influenced by the emerging ruling military bureaucratic alliances, the alliance's perception of security situation in Pakistan, the Awami League's active support of the decision during Suez crisis led to internal schism within the organization. Radicals, both communist and non-communist socialists, such as Maulana Bhashani, questioned the necessity of such political alignment that violated the basic principles of non-alignment movement. More importantly, these radicals felt that when in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Muslim world, emerging national liberation struggles opposed such military blocs, Pakistan should stay away from these exercises. Unfortunately, these radicals formed a rival political organization, namely National Awami Party, based on a program of opposition to imperial alignment. This close connection between Cold War military political alignment and the rise of pro-Western, supposedly modernizing military junta in Pakistan defined a critical parameter of politics in long 60s. A critical feature of long 60s was the questioning of cultural politics of national integration promoted by military bureaucratic regimes. It was also a period marked by growing peasant protest and labor and student militancy in Pakistan. All these movements challenged the process of capitalist modernization process, which led to the increasing inequity along class, regional, and ethnic lines. These protests were also matched by deeper social transformation marked by ethnic cleansing, capital flight from the province, changing dynamics of class formation, immiseration of peasantry, and narrowing down of democratic possibilities of accommodation. It was within these 60s there existed a period of high 60s when in 1968-69, students, workers, and peasants revolted against military bureaucratic power edifice. Globally, in the 20th century, years around 1968-69 became what 1948 was to Europe in the 19th century. So when did this long period of revolutionary experimentation, cultural interrogation of status quo, and politics of hope matched by dialectical antipodes of fratricidal violence, coups, and military dictatorship and Cold War violence came to an end? While globally, most left scholars view the coup in Chile in 1973 as the end of a revolutionary era, in many ways in the Muslim world, Iranian Revolution marked the end of radical possibilities of global 60s as radicalism now took different ethno-religious and cultural terms based upon the questioning the efficacy of notions of modernity. The historic concurrence of Said's publication of Treatise on Orientalism and the occurrence of Iranian Revolution indicate this intellectual and political transition. This passage was reflected in East Pakistan. He slowly veered towards a nationalist uprising. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was the pivotal icon of this Bengali nationalism. The idea of Bangladesh as a land of Bengalis became more popular than the earlier nationalist notion of Pakistan as a homeland of Muslims in 1970. On March 25, 1971, the military crackdown on radical nationalist movement snowballed into a genocide of East Pakistanis, now identified mostly as Bengalis. The guerrilla war of 1971, in the midst of tensions of Cold War, culminated into the liberation of Bangladesh. Yet the new state witnessed the continuation of unfinished debates and confrontation over the radical agenda of 1960s. It led towards an undeclared civil war between pro-Chinese and independent Marxist forces on the one hand, and the centrist and pro-Soviet forces aligned with Sheikh Mujib on the other. The process led to a stalemate or an equilibrium between forces demanding within quote scientific socialism and the establishment creed of so-called within quote democratic socialism. The stalemate, ironically, was resolved by a series of bloody military coups that culminated in the rise of a Caesar, to use a Gramscian term, in the form of General Ziaur Rahman, a man of center-right political persuasion. In the newly established polities like Bangladesh and truncated Pakistan, the successive rise of military generals such as two General Zias, Ziaur Rahman in Bangladesh and Ziaul Haq in Pakistan, signified the return to path dependency based upon model of governance in the united Pakistan in the Cold War era, whereby army emerged as the custodian of the state, which followed within quote market-friendly policies and legitimized its appeal through a moderate dose of Islam for public consumption. It signaled an end to the radical decade of 60s. Yet, as Bernardine Dohrn, in a review of a book on 1960s in US, argued that the 60s began in 1954, and the real news is that they are not over yet. The adumbration, now I come to the second section, the contradictions and contestations, conceptualizing the making of Bangladesh as a product of global 60s. The adumbration of the Student Revolution and subsequent national liberation struggle in East Pakistan to global 60s require a conceptual reordering of the so-called Bengali nationalism. The global frame of reference necessitates a new conceptual approach towards understanding local transformation within a transnational framework that is informed by cross-currents of multiple geopolitical, ideological, economic, and cultural questions. These questions indicate a concurrence of several similar actions across diverse geographical locations. For South Asianists, the use of the term global 60s involves an attempt at thematic exposition of local anti-colonial and wider anti-imperial struggles. Various protest movements made attempts to class-based social reconfiguration in the context of Cold War. Yet Cold War geopolitics obviously constricted the boundaries and transfigured the conclusions of these attempts at social transformations. Despite radical left movements, such as in East Pakistan National Army Party's early efforts in 1950s to transcend the extended reach of the Cold War, it was clear by the beginning of 1971 that the resolution of democratic question in East Pakistan would no longer be able to escape the whirlwind of geopolitical realities that swirled around them. Gary J. Bass's Blood Telegram, or Sinath Raghavan's 1971, A Global History of the Creation of Bangladesh, aptly highlights the impacts of Cold War alignments on the making of Bangladesh. Yet both these books, despite their obvious strength, particularly Raghavan's tome, de-recognize the critical significance of East Pakistani actors and their attempts at their own liberation against the background of multifarious ideological meanings of Cold War. Indeed, a critical characteristic of global 60s is the complexities of ideological struggle within the left that took place under the shadow of another Cold War, namely the Sino-Soviet rivalry. The critical impact of Chinese Revolution on ideological debates within the left remains an understudied subject. While the impact of China's foreign policy was rather limited, the effect of China's critique of Soviet positions was far-reaching. Beginning in the late 1950s, numerous activists, politicians, and intellectuals visited China from East Pakistan. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was one of them. He recalled his visit to China in elaborate details in his published autobiography and a travelogue. Maulana Bhashani met directly with Zhou Enlai and was deeply impressed by China's message of agrarian revolution. Indeed, in 1950s, National Awami Party, hereafter NAP, in which Communist Party of Bangladesh of East Pakistan was a principal clandestine constituent, emerged as a critical alternative to Awami League Party. The pivotal advocate of regional autonomy for East Pakistan. Yet the NAP lost its efficacy to some extent when the party split. The seemingly pro-Chinese Bhashani wing of NAP played a critical role in organizing peasant protests during the 1969 struggle. But the division among the left between pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese wings, and later the further fragmentation of the pro-Chinese left into several rival such as Communist Party of East Pakistan Marxist-Leninist and Communist Party of East Bengal Marxist-Leninist profoundly influenced the outcome of global 1969 in East Pakistan. The internal schisms within the left and pro-Chinese left's growing distance from nationalist upsurge created a political vacuum in the protest movement. Meanwhile, the pro-Soviet Communist Party became closely aligned with the autonomy movement, but the party could not establish a distinctive mark on it as it had much fewer followers and acted as a battered remnant of earlier robust but clandestine communist network. Its thesis of national democratic revolution rendered it into an ineffectual follower of Awami League. As a consequence of this internal paralysis of the left, Awami League could establish a hegemonic position within the pro-democracy movement. The military crackdown on 26 March and the declaration of independence on 25th March and declaration of independence on 26th March led to the opening up of opportunity of further radicalization of political agenda of Bengali nationalism. Yet the confusion on the part of left due to their conflicting interpretation of the implication of global geostrategic maneuverings of China in South Asian context rendered them ineffective during the liberation struggle. In post-liberation Bangladesh, Cuba's own contribution to this ideological critique of Soviet Marxism was similarly profound. Many nationalist-minded Bengalis were inspired by Cuba's independent brand of Marxism, though never followed its direct dictum or had close connections with the Cuban Communist Party. An emergent new left in the form of Jashod, or National Socialist Party, in Bangladeshi context placed a renewed emphasis on armed struggle and in doing so posed a direct challenge to the more established Soviet-aligned center-left coalition of Awami League, Communist Party of Bangladesh, and pro-Soviet National Awami Party. Armed confrontations in post-liberation Bangladesh clearly had deeper historical resonance with similar splits elsewhere in the world. A second theme, crucial in Pakistan context, is the question of internal colonization and the idea of national liberation within it. This gave rise to the rhetorical power of Sheikh Mujib and Bengali nationalism as a new post-colonial force. Bengali nationalism had also sought to explore how other third world intellectual, political, and cultural currents shaped the sentiments, strategies, and tactics of building post-colonial cultural identities. More broadly speaking, the empowerment of third world itself served as a driving force towards realization of Bengali political aspirations. For the left, the pursuit of national liberation required rupturing the compact of US foreign policy and Pakistan military junta. It also questioned the stranglehold of the military-sponsored financial oligarchs over Pakistan's national resources. As a consequence, the rhetoric of national liberation in East Pakistan, in its more radical forms, envisioned the absolute recuperation of national resources, the elimination of a military-sponsored financial oligarchy's control over national resources, complete sovereignty in international relations, particularly in relation to Pakistan and India, and the forging of a national consciousness. Like all nationalisms, the latter had a xenophobic impulse. The result was a complicated but unsuccessful process of repression by Bengali nationalists of signs of cultural hybridity, aiming at Urdu-speaking Muhajir community and indigenous Hill people who constituted nested minorities within Bangladesh. Nationalism thus acted as Damocles' sword on Bangladeshi society. Vital to the understanding of the complex divisions within the left and nationalists is an examination of culture and relationship between politics, national identity, and the global counterculture. Indeed, the 1960s produced an international language of dissent within a transnational circulation and appropriation of common written text, film, graphic arts, music, and individuals associated with left. Thus, one must take into account here the ideological impact of Nazim Hikmat, Paul Robeson, or songs associated with civil rights movement on both sides of Bengal. Indeed, both sides of Bengal had its own robust counter-hegemonic culture movement grounded in an original understanding of folk music and avant-garde reconstruction of people's song. These movements are by no means external to the debates occurring on the issues related to the empowerment of workers, peasants, and youth. On the contrary, they were intertwined with those conversations of struggle against class-based exploitation, state-sponsored religious nationalism, and patriarchal familial restraints and individual pursuits. Indeed, the meaning of a presumably given ethnic identity in the context of East Pakistan, such as the term Bengali, is fraught with tensions and significant contestations. The idea of a linguistic identity that local populations shared with Indian Bengal did not automatically translate into a plank of cultural and political mobilization. A new form of poetry, songs, celebration of cultural rituals, and political readings of linguistic cultural identity rendered into existence in the limited context of amorphous category of middle class, a wider Bengali identity that recognized shared cultural existence of a linguistic community for nearly 1,000 years across recently drawn colonial boundaries. Finally, a discussion of global 60s should incorporate discussions of the debate and practices on the right as well. This research aims to take more seriously the profoundly anti-secular ideologies found among Islamist groups. Though Islamist groups opposed military bureaucratic compact led by Ayub Khan in the high 60s, they were increasingly sponsored by military bureaucratic ruling junta. By high 60s, I mean 1968, 69, 1970. In East Pakistan, Jamaat-e-Islam emerged as a pivotal Islamist organization. Jamaat organized a counter-propaganda against secularizing nationalist and socialist movements to restrain the reach of the mobilization of the left reflected reach of the nationalist and socialist politics. At the same time, right-wing responses to the mobilization of the left reflected a genuine concern with the destabilization of Muslim national identity of Pakistan. Such destabilization and challenges to Islamic identity of Pakistan, according to Jamaat, was clearly evident in the iconoclastic and irreverent aesthetic and moral practices celebrated by the countercultural movements of the Bengali nationalists and the left. Now I come to the concluding section. Though the narrative here focuses on the unfolding of events during global 60s in Bangladesh, the underlying analysis shared theoretical framework derived from ideas about internal colonization. In analyzing politics in East Pakistan and Bangladesh, it is necessary to deal with the idea of internal colonization. The term internal colonization is conceptualized as per the definition provided by Harold Wolff. According to Wolff, internal colonization refers to a situation when within a single nation state, a relationship characteristics of the external relationships between imperialist states and their colonies persist. This categorization of internal colonization may invite the charge of overtly superficial functional approach to colonization as a social, economic, and political process. But there existed another deeper historical reason to refer to East Pakistanis as victims of internal colonization. Internal colonialism remains central to the evolution of a national identity in Bengal among Muslims. In the British imperial era, there existed two different modes of governance and colonization in Bengal. While imperial rulers constituted the government that presided over the siphoning of surplus, it partially delegated the management of rural resources in Bengal to intermediary tenure holders. In Bengal, high caste Hindu landholding elites and associated lower service elites refashioned language and orchestrated classicization of culture in a manner that marginalized and ostracized Bengali Muslim cultural sensitivities. The situation became more problematic as the process of economic marginalization of Bengali Muslims was accompanied by customary discrimination based upon high caste Hindu rules of purity and pollution. Language also remained a critical marker of difference here. Even when Bengali authors such as Mir Mosharraf Hossain search for alternative venue of classicization of Bengali Muslim culture with reference to historic events in Arabia, he scrupulously omitted reference to colloquially used word in Bengali language, a Bengali Muslim household, including Allah. In post-colonial era, as a reaction to such cultural marginalization, Bengali Muslim cultural personalities promoted Urdu words, and it was not an historic accident that the first seminal cultural organization in Dhaka was named Tamaddun Majlis, both being Urdu words and were rather uncommonly used in Bengali. However, the military junta's attitude, the emerging military bureaucratic junta's attitude towards Bengali language as an un-Islamic language and as a backward language incapable of promoting national integration actually prompted a backlash from the below. I am actually skipping, and I am now going to the concluding section so that I can keep it within the time. I don't know whether I have crossed the time limit. From first, let me conclude. The military bureaucratic compact failed to provide a cultural hegemony. This became a classic situation of, in the words of Ranajit Guha, dominance without hegemony. From such a perspective, it would seem that in many respects, the Army League was to play the decisive role in an attempt to consolidate such an historic bloc and in the hybridization rather than overthrow of the colonial state in Pakistan. Yet the inflexible attitude of military bureaucratic junta and revolutionary dynamics from below undermined such neat transition. The military bureaucratic compact in 1969 in its Pakistani context was premised upon ethno-linguistic divide bordering on racial exclusivity of colonial regime. Thus, the revolution of 1969 triggered a crisis in military bureaucratic compact. In this period of crisis, a new relation between structures and superstructures was required, corresponding to the new constellation of historic forces. Was a new historic bloc formed in Bangladesh as opposed to Pakistan, linking the disparate elements of a within national bourgeoisie to the residual functionaries of the post-colonial state, whose previous role had been mainly coercive, its bureaucracy and judiciary, the police and the military. Did Bangladesh in her respective ways experience a modernizing within passive revolution of sorts, originating in this day conjuncture? Clearly, the creation of any post-colonial, post-liberation hegemony required more than the conclusion of a political deal to create cohesion and solidarity between old and new elites, making up a new political ruling class whose function was not simply to dominate, but to lead an uneven and fractious alliance of subordinate classes and communities. Yet given the hyper-mobilized state of Bangladeshi society and ideological polarization among radical political activists, no mechanism was available to achieve hegemony. More would have been required. The new state had not only to assimilate the intellectuals inherited from the Praetorian neo-colonial state and its institutions, but recruit those organic intellectuals whose links to masses and to civil society were not simply formal or bureaucratic. As Gramsci has stressed, it was necessary for the intellectual not just to know, but to understand and feel her relation to the people. Hence, the significance of civil society reconceived to include the whole domain of culture, discourses, and language, literature, folklore, and indeed the whole universe of symbolic representation to be found in the popular culture, or rather popular cultures of the land. As Gramsci argued that revolutions had to wage within quote a war of position, a long struggle on the terrain of civil society, with the aim of changing what is called within quote common sense of doing politics. Yet to understand the pattern of state formation in post-liberation context, we can put Gramsci into dialogue with Fanon. Fanon clearly warned in his posthumously published work, The Wretched of the Earth, that if the post-colonial nations failed to produce socially committed elites, then the state might lead towards a culture of racketeers who would simply be the caricature of their Western mentors, or in the case of Bangladesh, to paraphrase Fanon, earlier military bureaucratic compact. In such context, the liberation movement would become one-party regime, and there would emerge within quote a modern form of bourgeois dictatorship, without mask, without makeup, without scruple, and cynical, and a path to tribalist dictatorship achieves coherence and authority, and a path to tribalist dictatorship. And there I end.
Thank you very much, sir, for your enlightening speech. Now I would like to call Salimullah, sir, for introducing our guest and give your remarks. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thank you, Afsana. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Am I audible? Okay.
Yes,
so it is a great pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Subho Basu. You all have heard him now. I think it is not necessary to introduce himself. His speech has already introduced him. So I would rather turn over to the subject matter after speaking online about him. We were already trying to welcome Professor Basu on behalf of our Center for Advanced Theory, and we actually scheduled a meeting on April 21 or 20th. So it is very good to be able to at least listen to him in a virtual space. And mostly, I agree with what he has said. You know, his educational background is rich. He's a checkered career, educated in India, United Kingdom, and he taught among other countries in United Kingdom, in US, and in Canada. He's now teaching at McGill, you know. And the subject matter that he has addressed is central to the political thought in Bangladesh. So, though he is introduced as a professor of history, I should welcome him as a thinker on political lines of Antonio Gramsci and Frantz Fanon, quoting from whom he ended his speech. What I appreciate in his presentation is that to present the liberation movement of Bangladesh, or independence movement, if you like it, which began as an autonomy movement within Pakistan, in global context. Only one word I would add on the global context. Why did the crisis begin in the 1960s? And as he aptly quoted another author saying that which really began in 1954. This must be seen with the crisis of the hegemony of the United States as the global change maker at that time. The US was the essential victor of all nations in the Second World War. But US hegemony began to waver and end by the middle of the 1960s. One proof, among others, is that by 1971, US government had to close their gold window. The fixed exchange rate of the US dollar had to be gone off. And we went on a flexible exchange rate regime. That is an indication of the crisis. And socially, Vietnam War was a contributing factor among other things. Because the US ran a huge amount of international debt, inflation rates could not be contained, which later on became called stagnation. Both unemployment and inflation went together. We keep this in mind. Now, within the new colonial game, Pakistan became, though an independent state, it simply switched its leadership or its hegemons from England to US. And within that context, we had this unresolved problem of Bangladesh. What I understand from Professor Bosu's speech is that there was a national question unresolved in 1947. We have to address that, which he has probably not time enough to address it, is that why did Bengali Muslims, so-called, they had aligned themselves at the end of the British regime, Punjabi military bureaucratic elites created Pakistan. We should not forget that Pakistan was a popular movement in East Bengal, especially in East Bengali Muslim society. So keeping that, this was, they, for example, name Tamuddin. These words are Arabic words. Tamuddin really means civilization, Majlis means assembly. So why did they adopt this Arabic words through Urdu? Is because of their identity as Muslims, but at the same time, we must not forget the role of this organization, behind which was also the presence the former General Secretary of Bengal Muslim League, Abul Hashim, or at least his blessings was there, which is that the Bengali identity within Pakistan must be upheld. And Tamuddin Majlis, as every historian knows, made a substantial contribution to in the initial stage of the language movement, which ultimately led to the state of Bangladesh. I think we have to take both of these strengths with equal stress. I, for one, would emphasize this formation of a nation state at the end of the British rule, which was peculiarly called Partition of India. There were only 2 states in the whole of India. But what was India before the British took over? We are still under the myth of the Mughal government. But as a matter of fact, in the 18th century, in India, there were at least, I would say, 6 or 7 national formations going on. In Mysore, in the Maratha Swarajya, in Awadh, in Rajputana, in Bengal, let's speak about where the British regime began. So the end of British rule was something like unification of India, we thought. But instead of giving freedom to many Indian states, India as a subcontinent is no smaller than Europe as a continent. So in fact, there were many nations which were amalgamated, first under the Mughal Empire, then under the British Empire. But the national question was not really resolved. We must see the emergence of Bangladesh not just as an event. This is my proposition. Within the Pakistan movement, it had a long background before that. Unfortunately, this is not the platform where we should be discussing the whole thing. I would say within the Pakistan state, when the Bengali Muslims of East Bengal and all Bengalis within East Pakistan, Muslims and Hindus united, we must emphasize that, for their national rights, right of national autonomy first, and it became, independent movement. So then within this East Bengali society, within the peasantry, classes were being formed. Peasant classes, I will call them in the plural, because there were upper class Joddhas who played a role in the Pakistan movement, and then the new peasants and the new working classes which were being formed in different centers of West Pakistan, they also played the substantial role. In the 1960s, you see, student bodies played, and also working classes of Tongi, Narayanganj, and Khulna, they played a role. Pakistan government tried to divide Hindus and Muslims. So the slogan of Bangladesh movement was a slogan of secularism, because it needed unity of Hindus and Muslims since 1950s. Language movement was the initial ground. Then in the 60s, why the slogan of socialism was raised? Because the newly formed industrial working classes, especially jute workers, played a substantial role. Their unions show this validity. So taking all this together, I would say, if we take 3 strands into our discussion, it will justify a reference to both Gramsci and Fanon. Within global context, Pakistan was part of the US neo-colonial empire. And Pakistani military and bureaucratic junta, they consciously sided with this. And they were collaborated by many leaders from Bengal, including the great Hussain Shahid Sohrawardi. So I would say, second strand was really the strand of formation of nationality in East Bengal is an independent process, I would say, which remained unaccomplished at the end of 1940s. The alliance that was made with the nationalities on religious grounds, albeit with the Punjabis, the Sindhis, who are called West Pakistanis, was a temporary alliance. And this is what has broken up in the 60s. So in as much as it is true, the formative movement of Bangladesh or the making of Bangladesh has a substantial standing in the global configuration. If we compare why it succeeded, why in Biafra, a so-called separatist movement in the late 60s failed, we will see the importance of the role of the people and united. Biafra was a movement of the minority, but here it was the majority within Pakistan. And also, some people thought that now there will be, what kind of a Bengali nationalism is this? Yes, nationalism appears in these days to be a suspect thing. It was a Bengali nationalism only within Pakistan. It was a call for unity of all Bengalis only within Pakistan. It did not give a call for all Bengalis in the world, or for that matter in the neighboring state of West Bengal in India. One proof of this is that, initially the national flag that was designed during the War of Liberation, it had a map of East Pakistan at the center of the sun, which is now at the center of our national flag. So that shows an anxiety of the middle class that whether it is a call for integrating Indian Bengalis with the East Bengali Bengalis. In order to put off that, it was made clear that this is only a movement within Pakistan. That is why I say the national question in India needs also to be discussed to really understand the international perspective of this. Now I'll make one more remark and close my welcome speech. At the end of the speech, though, is that Srinath Raghavan's book, which is well discussed, it has an inbuilt bias within it. It tries to, the very name itself discusses the bias or marginalization of the role of the people of Bangladesh. He called it in 1971 a global history of the creation of Bangladesh. A creation, it is a job of God. What we do human beings called procreate. So he has given a role of creation to India-Pakistan war. In fact, this is the main narrative today about the history of Bangladesh. It is still in the hands of writers from outside Bangladesh who think that the creation of Bangladesh was a byproduct of an India-Pakistan conflict. Yes, it is an important dimension, no doubt. But the creation of Bangladesh is the making of Bangladesh. I welcome and I appreciate Professor Basu's lecture as the making of Bangladesh is an important correction to the creation of Bangladesh. So I think people's role or Prince of Denmark's role in the play Hamlet is important. And then within the people, now the real dialectic begins after independence, in the midst of which we are now in. I would simply emphasize the reference to Frantz Fanon. His chapter in Wretched of the Earth called Pitfalls of National Consciousness, or if we translate directly from French, it is called Misadventures of National Consciousness, Mésaventures de la Conscience Nationale. It says this, that it is not enough to gain independence from imperial powers. It is important that you, excuse me for a second, let me close the window. Yes, sound coming. I would simply add this, that the role of the people still remains to be asserted. That's why the book I edited along with my friends is called Passive Revolution. In Bengali, we call it Behat Biplab, where the chief contribution was made by the late Ahmed Safa. The essay is called Bangladesher Rajnotik Jotilota. I think that I will only quote one line from Ahmed Safa and close with this. He says that Bangladesh should become an independent state or independent nation, setting a very bad example for Indian subcontinent in terms of self-determination of nations on a historical scale, was not welcomed, obviously not by US, not by Pakistan. Ahmad Safa asserts it was not welcomed even by Russia, China, or even for that matter India, which played the role of what is called midwife in the birth process of Bangladesh. Then how come Bangladesh movement succeeded? According to Ahmad Safa, it is solely because of what you call the hegemony achieved by the national liberation movement in Bangladesh through the questions of language, secularism, and socialism. All these strands made a substantial contribution. The unity of Hindus and Muslims expressed through the slogan of secularism, and then the participation of the working classes through the slogan of socialism, which was enshrined in the 11 points movement of the students. And of course, we all know the movement, the main leaders, Awami League 6-point program, worked as a forging mechanism of the national forces. But this is, we must say, this is my last appeal. The creation or making or liberation or independence of Bangladesh, whatever term you use, this is still a history in the making. So I welcome everybody to question and to also provide answers to Professor Basu's very challenging and enlightening speech.
Thank you,
you, Professor Subho Basu, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir. Afsana.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, sir, for your speech and welcoming everyone. And I would like to open the floor for question and answer. And before that, I would like to also thank, and I just want to express my gratitude to three of my very favorite teachers, Ms. Kamal sir, Sonia madam, and Iftekhar sir. And now I would like to, sir already have a question, Ms. Kamal sir.
Thank you.
So thank you, ma'am. We'll take the floor.
Thank you, Afsana. I think the questions, you can just read out the questions, and Ms. Basar and Sonia Appa and Iftekhar, you have the question, three questions you have. Your mic,
so
you have to unmute your.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have the questions, Afsana?
Yes, ma'am. I do have the question.
Okay, just Ms. Basar, sir, thank you very much for joining us. Can you just say your question by yourself? We would like to hear you.
Thank you very much, Shanaz. And really, thanks to ULAB for organizing this wonderful seminar. And it's great to hear Professor Subho once again, and also Professor Salimullah Khan. I made a couple of questions, 2-3 questions actually. I wanted, I request Professor Subho to enlighten us on peasant mobilizations in East Bengal in 1960s and how they were integrated with the liberation war in 1971. Particularly, I want to know from Professor Subho that Awami League being the leader of the liberation war movement in 1971. So how did the peasants got into the fold of Awami League and joined in the liberation war? And alongside that, I also asked, was there any influence of the global 60s on East Bengal peasants? That's your principal theme. And if yes, how was that influence exerted? And I also want to ask you, Professor Subho, I'm sorry if I'm asking too much, because we have got the opportunity to ask you here. How do you differentiate between internal colonization and colonization? You have chosen to use the word internal colonization, and many of us would differ on that. Please, would you kindly explain why you chose the term internal colonization in case of East Bengal? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Basu. We will get all the questions and you will answer together. I will request you, sir. And now I request Sonia Madam. Sonia Amin, Professor Dr. Sonia Amin, could you just Could you just let us know your question? If not, then Iftikhar, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Your question. Yeah, nice to see you
all here. And Shubhoda, it was wonderful. I was spellbound. I would rather hold for now. I will listen to others. In the meantime, I will see if I have any question.
Okay.
So I will pass it now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Is the Sonia madam here still? Afsana?
Ma'am, probably ma'am left.
If not, then you just can you just read out her question?
Yes, ma'am. Madam has a question to sir. That is, this was much needed perspective on the theme of East Pakistan quest for identity and emancipation, and later the War of Liberation war. Madam rather had a comment on it.
Okay.
I guess.
Okay then. Thank you. So the floor is again now. If no one has any more questions, then we request Professor Basu to comments on that. Yeah.
Okay, I think I shall start with Professor Khan's comments about the question of nationality formation. It is absolutely true that India, as I call it, it's a kind of a space of connected civilizations within which there took place various types of drives towards nationalization, towards the emergence of various types of nationalities. In fact, my own first chapter is called the issue of territoriality and nationality formation. And within that chapter, I have argued that the idea of India being the sole focus of national movement was more of a derivation from colonial states' projection of national identity. There existed obviously a very powerful strand of all India nationalist movement, but that was actually also a sum total of various types of nationality movement that was subsumed within that all India nationalist movement. Now, the question is that even Gandhi recognized it, and if one can talk about that even within the Indian National Congress in 1920, there took place a new resolution to reorganize Congress's own provincial committees along national line, along linguistic lines. By linguistic lines, they basically implicitly recognize the nationality, the emerging nationality question related to various territories within South Asian subcontinent. The idea is a notion of Petria. And there existed a notion, the Petria of Bengal. And in 1947, as we know, that there existed a movement whereby two rival kinds of notions of Bengal came into clash with each other. Unfortunately, because of the tensions that prevailed along religious lines, and also implicit within that religious tension, there was a class tension too. And that's where when we find that there was a United Bengal thesis put forward by Abul Hasan and Sharad Bose, which actually took Bengal as a kind of national, a kind of nationality, emerging nationality. On the other hand, there existed obviously two different forces that actually highlighted Indian nationality, or within Bengal, Nazimuddin and Maulana Akram Khan highlighted Pakistani nationality. But the bigger question of nationality formation was obviously there. It was not resolved. And in fact, Communist Party of India, Odhikari, proposed the thesis that British should actually transfer political power to different nationalities, linguistic nationalities in India, instead to two different broad political parties, Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. But that did not happen. and there were various types of conjectures that intervened in the process. But the idea of Bengali nationalism thus remained to a certain extent subsumed within the so-called Muslim nationalism within the Muslim homeland. Coming to Professor Misbah Kamal's question, in fact, that is the idea. I have actually made it very clear that the National Awami Party, particularly
PhD করা
Sheikh Mahin, please turn off your mic. Sheikh Mahin, thank you.
So, Professor Misbah Kamal, I actually said that in 1956, with the emergence of National Awami Party, under the leadership of Maulana Bhashani, there existed an alternative process of class-based mobilization, however inchoate that is, of East Bengali identity. And it was in 1968-69, Maulana Bhashani played a pivotal role in integrating the question, in bringing forth the question of peasant question into the East Bengali national question. And in fact, I actually mentioned in details how the mobilization with red hat, people wearing red hat, etc., played a very critical role. And the Maulana Bhashani's movement against tackle theft in rural Bengal, etc., actually built up a movement against the question of movement against the situation of colonization in East Pakistan. And that is, given that the situation, it is also true that why the NAP could not become a hegemonic force in the Pakistani national struggle, and it is East Pakistani national struggle, or the so-called Bengali national struggle, or Bangladesh national struggle is a better innovation. Bengali national struggle. And the reason for that was actually the kind of narrow interpretation of the Chinese and the Soviet positions, etc., and the inability of the communist parties within the Bangladesh to come together on a critical strand of accessing political power. So when they started the movement, they could not hold it on, and it became a nationalist movement to a certain extent under the hegemony of Awami League. And both East Bengal Communist Party and East Pakistan Communist Party and the Communist Party of East Pakistan, which was a pro-Soviet front, etc., remained remained subsumed within these broader nationalist movement, but they could not hegemonize the movement that they initiated from below in 1968-69. So that explains. The idea of internal colonization is obviously taken from the Latin American context, and I did not have time to explain why did I choose it. It seems that the military bureaucratic junta, the way they perceive the language, culture, etc., to a certain extent fostered a situation of internal colonization rather than a kind of what we call a colonization, where by colonization when we refer to distant colonization by a distant European power in the context of the late 18th and early 19th century, the rise of global capitalism. This neo-colonial forces of Pakistani military junta, which was aligned with, as it is correctly pointed out, it is aligned with US imperial power, did foster a situation of internal colonization in East Bengal. The other question is, the other aspect of it is in the East Bengal, obviously, there was a situation of internal colonization in the British period, which many people would not share, because even though people spoke the same language, there is a kind of Calcutta-centric cultural renaissance or cultural movement that was based upon a particular class configuration that to a certain extent marginalized articulation of East Bengali political aspiration. Obviously that to a certain extent in terms of class position, in terms of cultural organization, etc., to a certain extent fostered is a kind of internal colonization, but that to a great extent not only continued, but deepened in the context of East Pakistan. Now, as far as the Tamaddun Majlis, it is obviously an Arabic word. I do not know Arabic. I know Urdu as a language, and which I am actually, I can say that I can fluently speak and can read intermittently. I can read Arabic, but it makes no sense to me because it's the same script, but it's completely different language. And so, yes, there took place various kinds of words where Persian and Arabic were words were already there in Bengali languages, but in the late 19th century, some of these Persian and Arabic words were purged or marginalized, though not entirely, because if we remember Hutum Pachar Naqsha, a kind of treatise written in the middle of the 19th century, actually contained 1/3 of its words were actually Persian, Perso-Arabic words. So, but Tamaddun Majlis and the kind of the address they used to make, Hajarban, etc., were definitely an attempt to Persianize, if not Arabize, the language, but it actually died up because, and Tamaddun Majlis played a very critical role in fostering Bengali nationalist movement alongside various other forces. So I hope I tried to address the question, but I would go into greater details if you have time, and it would be a very it would be really enlightening to debate with Professor Kamal the question of internal colonization and various types of Marxist interpretations associated with the idea of internal colonization, etc., the idea of United States in the Black Belt, the internal colonization, the indigenous people in Latin America, the internal colonization, and someone would say that even the indigenous people in post-colonial Bangladesh, to a certain extent, faced a situation that is, to a certain degree, reflects internal colonization, of which Professor Kamal is obviously an expert in terms of the indigenous people's position in Bangladesh. That's all.
Thank you very much, sir. I guess Muhammad Nasirur Rahman have a question. Could you please ask that briefly, because we do not have much time to for this session. Thank you.
You mean Anisur Rahman or Nasirur Rahman?
Anisur Rahman.
Okay.
Sorry, Anisur Rahman, yes.
Thank you, Professor Subho, for your very amazing speech and a new kind that generated a new thought about the making of Bangladesh and the global history. I have a couple of points. If I understand your paper correctly, that you made a point and the broad theme that you wanted to elaborate in your paper is the contribution of Islam, Cold War, and the communist approach to look at the making of Bangladesh. So I was thinking that in 60s there was a liberal Islamic movement in Pakistan, particularly followed by the making of the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance during the Ayub Khan's rule. So the liberal force was so powerful at that time during 60s. So how do you think that the traditional movement that influenced by Iranian Revolution that impacted the Pakistani politics and the making of Bangladesh? Secondly, the Cold War politics, if I look at the Cold War history and Cold War impact during the partition of Southeast Asia and South Asia, Bangladesh was not in that influenced by Cold War politics the way Southeast Asian regions were impacted. The Bangladeshi Liberation War, although became a part of Cold War politics to some extent, but it was not directly impacted by the Cold War politics. So the last thing that I wanted to share with you, that perhaps do you think that instead of Islam or Cold War politics or the communist revolution or communist movements, that was the part of Cold War politics, and the whole Cold War politics was to suppress communist movements. So it was not so prominent in Bangladesh. So to me, it was the more economic question that actually played a significant role in making Bangladesh. And that economic question, it was the economic, inequality between East Wing and the West Wing of Pakistan. Actually, the decisive factor that played an important role in making up Bangladesh. So this is my understanding. So if you have any.
Yeah, the first part of your question is, I actually did not say that anyway the Iranian Revolution impacted Bangladesh. I said that Iranian Revolution ended the continuation of the era of global 60s, along with the publication of Edward Said's book, The Global 60s in the Muslim World. And that is a different question. That means that in 1978, Iranian Revolution actually took place much after the emergence of Bangladesh. In fact, when Bangladesh emerged, it was the Shah's regime that was there, which played a very critical role in supplying weapons to the Pakistani state. In fact, the United States could not directly supply weapons to Pakistan, so it tried to supply weapons through Iran. And so, but that is a Shah state. The idea of global 60s was a kind of flexible decade that to a certain extent incorporated various types of revolutionary movements. Some argued it had come to an end with the Chilean coup which deposed Salvador Allende from power in Chile. And some would argue that it came into existence with two important, one is Iranian Revolution, in the sense that in the Iranian Revolution, for the first time in the Middle East politics, after the Second World War, Islam became an important feature. Islam did not remain an important feature throughout the period between 1950 and 1971, except in cultural sense that people were Muslims. But in political sense, people were talking about pan-Arabism, people were talking about, in Iranian case, there was a peculiar notion of Aryan national identity, etc. And there was obviously a contestation between communists, again in Iran, etc. So that I spoke about the context of the global 60s.
You allow me 1 minute, Professor Subho.
At least let me finish and then we can intervene. So that is the first part. The second part is this, that East Pakistan and the Pakistan was deeply implicated in the Cold War. In 1954, had there not been a kind of Baghdad pact, and had there not been a Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, if Pakistan not been part of it, Pakistan would not have received massive arms supply and massive amount of foreign aid, which East Pakistan did not get share of, but Pakistani military junta received it, particularly from 1958 onwards. 1958, the Baghdad Pact came to an end, but from 1955 to 58, and it continued up to almost 1962. The kind of massive aid that actually transformed the politics in a kind of politics in West Pakistan and consolidated the military bureaucratic junta's role. It had been made very clear by Aisha Jalal's book, Martial Law in Pakistan. The second important thing is this, that in 1956, the Awami League, which was actually opposed to a certain extent the Baghdad Pact, during the Suez War, Awami League Supremo Said Suravarti actually committed himself to the Baghdad Pact in opposition to non-aligned movement, etc. And he gave a famous speech in which he said 0 plus 0 equals 0, which actually highlights his commitment. And that led to the split within Awami League, and National Awami Party came into existence because of the debate over the role of Pakistan during the Suez War, and that to a certain extent continued. There was a kind of a split within the National Awami Party because of the pro-Chinese and the pro-Soviet debates, etc. Played a very critical role. National Awami Party was reasonably powerful party in East Pakistan and was actually a kind of counter-hegemonic party to Awami League, though Awami League and National Awami Party remained remained in dialogue with each other, and at the same time confronted each other. And in 1968, 69, there was actually various kind of texts that were read within the radical nuclear circle within Awami League, were texts associated with Cold War, were texts associated with the revolution. Particularly, it incorporated texts like General Diop's kind of text. It incorporated Che Guevara's Coco theory. It incorporated Regis Debre's revolution within revolution, and all these kinds of things. So they actually, and in 1971, the very fact that the East Bengali guerrilla forces actually had to compete against a global force of the United States, and the United States was actually using Pakistani office to negotiate with China, and as a consequence, they did not actually pay much attention to the East Pakistan question. In fact, they actually opposed the East Pakistan question. It was in that context Soviet Union entered into an alliance with India, and as a consequence, we could find that there was a kind of polarization in the Soviet alliance, and on the other hand, Sino-Pakistani alliance backed by the United States. And so Cold War played a very pivotal role in the shaping of the emergence of Bangladesh. I mean, it was one of the most crucial factors. The fact that the military junta had the confidence not to share the resources, not to indulge in democratic process, etc., despite enacting some kind of constitution in 1956, is because they could secure alliance with the United States. And so it was very clear, and most people who were then active in East Pakistan in the autonomy movement were critically aware of this role by the United States. So in that way, I think that the Cold War played a very definitive role in the making of Bangladesh.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And I'm very sorry to everyone because we do not have much time to discuss anymore. I'm sure that after this long and enlightening discussion, we all have questions, but I'm sorry for this short time. Probably we are hoping to arrange another discussion about the whole thing. So now I would like to ask our head of the department, Professor Shahnaz Hussain Jahan, to say a few words and to conclude.
Thank you very much. In fact, students, colleagues, friends who are attending this seminar today, I'm really grateful to you all. And with your support, with your live participation, the program was really good. And thank you very much, Professor Dr. Subho Basu, for your interesting speech. And we are really enlightened. And also today's program is enriched with the presence of Professor Dr. Salimullah Khan, Professor Dr. Misbah Kamal, Professor Dr. Sonia Amin, and Professor Dr. Iftekhar Iqbal. Then we have Anisur Rahman with us. We do have our students and our colleagues from our general education department. And I think all of us really make this program very interesting. One thing we have to just mention, we all understand that everybody has thousands of questions in mind when listening this kind of speech, because making of Bangladesh or Bangladesh liberation or Bangladesh, whenever the discussion takes place like this, we take this issue as a personal issue. We can never, separate ourselves from the subject, and we can never look at objectively. So far we say that we want to look at it objectively, but it is very unfortunate or fortunate that we are very much within this, and we are very much attached to these things, because it is all our endeavor who made this Bangladesh today. Now, thank you very much, and I'm very sorry that we cannot entertain more questions, more answers, and I have to conclude the session. And thank you again, Professor Subho. Thank you, my professors here, and thank you, Professor Salimullah Khan, for your time and also organizing with us the event. And my sincere thanks also to the colleagues, Mr. M.M. Ajijul Russell, Mr. Rigan Chakma, and Ms. Afsana Anjum for organizing this event. And I'm truly thankful to the Mr. Arif Billah, Mr. Ariful Haq, Mr. Arif Billah's team, Mr. Wahidujjaman, Kopil Roy, for their technical support. Without your support, we would never be able to make this program successful. And thank you very much once again, and hoping to see you in future and in our another seminar, which we are going to organize soon. And we will love to have you all together again. Thank you very much once again, and have a good day. Thank you all.